Two legendary generals tried to build a fortress on this riverbank. Both failed. Both lost their heads to the enemy. By the summer of 1566, the mud of Tsunemata was choked with the blood of samurai who thought they were going to be the hero. Then, a nameless peasant stepped forward. He had no armor, no samurai lineage. The samurai court openly mocked him, treating him less than a human. But he told the warlord Oda Nobunaga that he could build the impossible fortress in just 3 days, or he would cut open his own stomach. He didn't fight the river, nor the enemy. He weaponized gravity. Miles upstream, in total secrecy, he had 1,000 carpenters prefabricate massive wooden walls and tie them into rafts. At midnight, under the cover of a torrential rainstorm, they cut the ropes. Hundreds of silent wooden fortresses floated down the Black River straight into the war zone. While the enemy slept through the storm, his men dragged the wood from the mud and slammed the pieces together like a midnight assembly line. When the sun rose, the enemy woke up to a living nightmare. Overnight, a fully functional wooden fortress stood where yesterday there was only empty mud. The battle was won without a single sword drawn, and the world finally learned the name of the peasant who built it, Hideyoshi. But the man who conjured a fortress out of a river was not a hero. The same mind that could outwit gravity in a single night would decades later march 39 women and children to a riverbank like this one, and have them executed, one by one, while the city watched. The peasant who saved 1,000 lives at Tsunemata would one day erase his own family to protect a ghost. To understand how the monkey became the monster, you have to go back. Back to a freezing winter morning and a pair of warm sandals. He started at the absolute bottom of human existence, a barefoot sandal bearer. The story that made his name goes like this. On a bitter winter morning, Nobunaga called for his shoes, and when he put them on, the leather was warm. Furious that a peasant had dared wear his footwear, he drew his sword on the young Hideyoshi. Instead of begging, the peasant bowed his head into the snow, pulled open his ragged shirt, and revealed a deep red welt across his bare chest. Ieyasu, he hadn't worn the sandals. He'd held the freezing leather against his naked skin for hours in the dark, so his master wouldn't feel the winter cold. Nobunaga laughed, spared him, and gave him a name that would follow him for life: the monkey. It wasn't a joke, it was a brand. A daily reminder from the samurai class that to them, he was property, less than human. And somewhere in that frozen mud, a cold realization took root. In a world ruled by iron and blood, honor was a sucker's game. If he couldn't be born a wolf, he would become something far more dangerous: the master illusionist. The man who would outbuild, outspend, and outmaneuver every noble lord on the island. And his takeover of an entire empire would begin the exact second his master's world went up in flames. June 2nd, 1582. The world tore itself open. One of his most trusted general betrayed Oda Nobunaga, surrounding him at Honnoji Temple and forcing him into the flames. If you want to understand the brutal philosophy that caused that temple to burn, watch our first video on Nobunaga, which will be linked at the end screen. When the news of Nobunaga's death hit Hideyoshi's war camp, he didn't waste a single second weeping. He started calculating. Hideyoshi was deep in enemy territory, 200 kilometers away, locked in a brutal siege. In just a matter of hours, he secretly negotiated a rushed peace treaty with his targets, packed up his entire army, and turned them around. What followed was the most insane logistical sprint in samurai history. The great Chugoku returned. 30,000 men marched through torrential rain, covering up to 40 kilometers a day, caked in mud and running on pure adrenaline. Hideyoshi knew the rules of the vacuum. Whoever killed the assassin would legally inherit the empire. By the time Nobunaga's own sons even realized their father was dead, the peasant had already marched into Kyoto, hunted down the traitor, and severed his head. He didn't just avenge the boss. He hijacked the entire corporate structure of the Oda clan from inside out, declaring himself the protector of Nobunaga's infant grandson. The noble heirs were left holding nothing but empty titles. The sandal-bearer had officially taken the wheel. By 1585, Hideyoshi had conquered the capital, but he faced a terrifying reality. Nobunaga had ruled through absolute terror, and it had gotten him murdered. Hideyoshi knew that a severed head only creates blood feuds, but a golden cup creates allies. He decided he wouldn't repeat his predecessor's mistake. He would instead seduce them. He pioneered a strategy of overwhelming extravagance. He constructed a portable tea room completely lined with pure gold leaf. The walls, the ceiling, the sliding doors, and every single utensil down to the kettle. Imagine a proud, traditional warlord, a man who has spent his entire life bleeding in the dirt, invited into this tiny, claustrophobic box. The room is lit only by charcoal fire, making the gold shimmer aggressively against a blood-crimson floor. Hideyoshi sits across from him, smiling, pouring tea from a solid gold pot. The message wasn't a display of luxury, it was psychological warfare. The gold was so blindingly bright, it literally made the warlord's eyes water. Hideyoshi was showing them a glimpse of an economic power so vast that fighting it was mathematically pointless. If they rebelled, Hideyoshi wouldn't just send soldiers. He would buy their supply lines, bribe their neighbors, and pay off their own retainers. He wrapped his enemies in a cage of silk, titles, and luxury, making them so comfortable they forgot how to swing a sword. By 1590, the Golden Cage had successfully pacified 95% of Japan. Only one massive threat remained: Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu was a silent predator, far too stable and far too smart to be seduced by a gold room. Hideyoshi realized he couldn't beat Ieyasu in a straight military campaign without tearing the country apart. So he made a devastating executive chess move. He stripped Ieyasu of his rich, historic ancestral homelands in central Japan. In exchange, he handed him a newly conquered, volatile territory in the Wild East, a desolate, malaria-ridden coastal marshland, Edo. It was a hostile public eviction meant to completely break Ieyasu's power. At this point, Hideyoshi controlled the armies of the entire unified nation. Ieyasu had no choice but to bow, pack his bags, and accept the humiliation. Hideyoshi watched him leave and poured another cup of sake, completely satisfied that he had ruined his greatest rival. What Hideyoshi's massive ego failed to realize was that 400 years later, that exact malaria-ridden swamp would be called Tokyo. Ieyasu didn't view the eviction as a death sentence. He viewed it as a blank canvas. While Hideyoshi wasted his fortune building massive, flashy castles in the capital, Ieyasu quietly stayed in the east, draining the marshes, engineering advanced canal systems, and building a hyper-efficient economic fortress. He accepted the exile because he was perfectly content to stay in the mud and wait for the peasant king to burn himself out. And the burnout was catastrophic. By 1591, nearly a decade into his absolute rule over Japan, the psychological handbrakes on Hideyoshi's ego completely snapped. First, his half-brother and chief diplomat died of illness. removing the only human being in Japan who had the guts to tell him no. Then came the legacy panic. Hideyoshi was an old man in his late 50s, obsessed with his peasant bloodline surviving. But he had no biological son. He had no choice but to adopt his adult nephew, Hidetsugu, naming him the official heir to the empire. Then, the impossible happened. In 1593, his favorite concubine unexpectedly gave birth to a healthy biological baby boy, Hideyori. Instantly, a dark, clinical paranoia consumed Hideyoshi's mind. He looked at his adult nephew not as family, but as an existential threat to his newborn baby. The charismatic underdog folk hero died that day, and an unhinged tyrant took his place. To clear the path for his infant son, Hideyoshi accused his nephew of a completely fabricated treason plot, forced him to commit ritual suicide. But he didn't stop there. He rounded up his nephew's entire household, 39 women and children, including teenage concubines and literal toddlers. He marched them like cattle through the streets of Kyoto to a public execution ground by the riverbank. Before the blades fell, the executioners placed the nephew's severed head on a wooden pedestal, forcing the young women and children to look into his dead eyes. For 5 agonizing hours, the executioners systematically slaughtered the family one by one, tossing the bodies of babies into a mass grave. The horrified public named it the Mound of Brutes. Hideyoshi was no longer ruling through seduction. He was erasing his own family to protect a ghost. The public was disgusted. The samurai class was horrified. Hideyoshi could feel the loyalty of his warlords slipping away, and his aging mind came up with a desperate, delusional solution. He needed a massive external distraction to keep his restless warriors from turning on his baby son. He decided to conquer Asia. He declared war on Korea with the ultimate goal of invading China and India. But Hideyoshi didn't actually go to the front lines. He stayed safely behind in Japan, hiding inside a sprawling, artificial palace complex on the cliffs of Kyushu. Surrounded by gold and watching theatrical plays, he completely detached himself from reality, writing insane imperial commands on silk scrolls. Across the sea, reality was a nightmare. 200,000 samurai were shoved onto wooden warships and pushed out into the freezing black waves of the Tsushima Strait. They found themselves caught in a horrific, multi-year meat grinder against Korean and Chinese forces. They were freezing, starving, and bleeding out in the mud of a foreign land, completely aware that they were dying for nothing more than the unhinged ego of an old man who refused to admit he was mortal. The invasion completely bankrupted Hideyoshi's treasury and exhausted the military strength of his most loyal Western lords. And who stayed completely out of the Korean meat grinder? Who kept his massive army 100% healthy, wealthy, and untouched inside his eastern fortress? Tokugawa Ieyasu. By 1598, the game was over. Hideyoshi lay dying in his palace, his body wasting away from sickness, his mind broken by the failure of his overseas war. On his deathbed, he looked at his 5-year-old son, Hideyori, and realized the terrifying truth. He was leaving a toddler alone in a room full of starving wolves. In a state of absolute desperation, Hideyoshi summoned the 5 most powerful lords in Japan to his bedside. He made them sign oaths of loyalty in their own blood, begging them to protect his boy until he was old enough to rule. And the man he begged the hardest, the man he appointed as the head of the council, was Tokugawa Ieyasu. Hideyoshi closed his eyes and took his final breath, completely blind to the ultimate tragic irony of his life. By building that overnight castle out of spite, by hoarding gold leaf to mask his insecurity, and by exiling his rival to an eastern swamp, he hadn't secured his legacy. He had systematically destroyed his own bloodline, emptied his own treasury, and forced his deadliest enemy to build the richest fortress in Japan. Hideyoshi died thinking he had bought a kingdom with gold. He had actually just spent his entire life building a throne for the man waiting quietly in Tokyo. The peasant's 16-year dream was over. But the bloodline he slaughtered and the lords he bankrupted were merely the final dominoes in a tragedy that began the night the temple burned at Honnoji. If you want to see how this empire was first forged in blood and betrayal, watch the story of Oda Nobunaga, the demon warlord who started it all. Because before the monkey could rule, the demon had to fall.